Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to plenary session 8 of the Conclave, which is on future of democracy, political agility, and innovation in the new world. In this session, we'll explore how political innovations will change democracy in the future. We are joined today by Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, INC, Dr. Sanjeev Goenka, Co-Chairman, NLC 2021 and Chairman, RP Sanjeev Goenka Group, and Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai, Consulting Editor, India Today Group. A warm welcome to all of you. May I now request Dr. Goenka to introduce the session and our speakers. Over to you.
Thank you, Rekha. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, Indian National Congress. Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai, Consulting Editor, India Today Group. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a special session on a very important issue. Relevant, pertinent. With our chief guest for the session, who's not only erudite and eloquent, but highly capable, strong intellectual, a man of many talents, a man who's traversed different roles in a very successful career, a man with a way with words and ideas, a man at home in both the domestic and international arena, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. It's an honor and pleasure to have you with us, and many thanks for agreeing to do the session and sticking on with it despite your tryst with illness. You're truly a new age politician. You bring class and gravitas to political competition. Rajdeep, it's always a pleasure to have you. And thank you for agreeing to moderate this session. As you all know, Rajdeep is a veteran journalist and author of many books on contemporary politics. He has his finger on the pulse of the ongoing political revolution. Sometimes becomes unpopular because of his forthrightness. But all I can say is that every morning he shares with me little snippets which make my morning very worthwhile. Thank you, Rajdeep. Thank you for being with us. I'm sure all of you agree that democracy is undergoing a big change, and the proliferation of social media has removed all filters from political discourse. There is a direct digital interaction between the political leaders and the public. And new technology enables new ways of mobilizing political constituencies, and change is happening in the way politics is done. Change and democracy must keep up with the new social trends in society. To discuss this further, to throw more light, it is my pleasure and privilege to ask Rajdeep to take over and moderate this session. Thank you, Rajdeep. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sanjeev, for that very kind introduction, and always a pleasure to be at an AIMA convention, and a double pleasure to have my fellow senior from school, Campion School, one of the few from my school who's a member of Parliament, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. So thank you very much, Shashi, and I wish you well. I'm told you've taken a COVID test, and I hope you pass the test and recover soon. So,
thank you. Well, good to see you both.
He hasn't tested positive as yet, otherwise this will become breaking news. But I wish you all the very best. I know you've been campaigning aggressively in Kerala. It's a very interesting subject that you've chosen, the future of democracy, political agility, and innovation in the new world, because we are in an increasingly digital world, and the impact of that on politics is being felt in every way. But I want to start, Dr. Tharoor, with something that is in the news, because you've been through a very long campaign in Kerala. We've just seen, or we're going through a very long campaign in West Bengal. All of this taking place in COVID times, numbers of cases increasing exponentially. But on the ground, and I was in Bengal last week, very little masking, no social distancing. And therefore, it leads me to ask this, and I'm linking it to the digitization around us. Could elections have been fought in a Kerala or a West Bengal through simply an expanded digital footprint? That politicians who speak to us about do gaz ki duri, about social distancing, none of you or very few of you walk the talk. Would I be right in saying that election campaigning remains a step behind what it should be in a more digital world?
I'm not sure that's entirely fair, though I would agree with you that in an ideal world, we would respond to COVID by taking steps like that. The truth is that even in the developed West, there still is no substitute for rallies, for public gatherings, and for your own smile to win votes rather than a masked appearance. In Kerala and in Bengal, I think where we went wrong was in the length and duration of the campaigns, particularly, I would say, Bengal with 8 phases, which with hindsight surely must strike the election commission as having been grossly unnecessary. And as a result, of course, the prolonged campaign meant a prolonged level of exposure and frequent repetition. I would say that as a practical proposition, it became impossible to campaign in Kerala while maintaining COVID protocols in any sensible sense of the term. I would step out of my car wearing a mask. I'd be instantly mobbed and surrounded by party workers and the crowd. I would be sort of thrust onto a stage. On the stage, if I began speaking with a mask, the shouts would go up, take your mask off. And of course, since I'm on stage and there's a distance, I would take the mask off. But quite often, I'm afraid, people would cluster around me, even on stage, before I could put the mask back on. When you're on these ruts, waving at people on the what we call the paryadnams, the sort of the paryatan, if you like, in Hindi, where you are actually trying to show your face to the people, a masked face will not win votes. And so you again tend to demask yourself, and if anybody else on that vehicle with you has the virus, you'll get it. So it really isn't easy for anyone on the traditional campaign trail to avoid exposure. Now, you're suggesting, can we all stay at home or in conference rooms and broadcast on digital media? As I said, I'm not sure that's yet been tried even in the developed world fully. And certainly in India, we would immediately be open to accusations of elitism, that we'd be bypassing the bulk of the public. In fact, by and large, politics is a field for the disenfranchised, the poor, the ordinary folks. The people who are likely to come and crowd into a Maidan are not the ones who are going to be sitting at home with a mobile phone or a laptop and listening to you digitally. So you would be appealing to a different constituency. All of us use social media. We used little video messages, we used YouTube, we used interviews. We did all of that stuff, but only as an add-on to the core in-person campaigning for which no one still seems to imagine any viable substitute.
It's interesting the way you're putting it, because then this puts the entire sort of debate over, the expanded digital democracy, perhaps in some context. What you seem to suggest, Dr. Tharoor, is that there is no substitute for the human connect. That, corporate India can work from home. Journalists, in a way, certainly can anchor programs sitting at home. But when you are in public life, necessarily the human connect, or indeed even just seeing your face, as you said, even a mask is not good enough. You think that's almost necessary, that some things will not change. Certain traditions will not change, even in a so-called new world.
Well, traditions have changed, but not that fundamentally. They've changed, for example, in the sense that, when I contested in 2009, I was the only candidate with his own website. Forget any other form of social media. By 2014, as we all know, not only was I no longer the only one, but I had even been eclipsed in terms of Twitter followers by Narendra Modi. And by 2014, pretty much every significant politician in India had a social media account. Twitter, YouTube, Facebook were all being pressed into service. So changes have happened, and of course, they've galloped exponentially since then. The entire phenomenon of WhatsApp groups has been key to the BJP's campaign strategies everywhere. They literally have people paid salaries to run, hundreds of WhatsApp groups, each one with 256 members, often with targeted messaging, reinforcing the prejudices they want to reinforce, or the points of view they want to communicate. All of this has changed our democracy. So let's not get it wrong. Social media has come into importance. All of you in the media who initially were resistant, I remember the hostility I encountered when I first bypassed the media by going straight to the public on social media. Within a fairly short while, all of you embraced it yourselves, you notably, Rajdeep, and others. And as a result, you yourselves are amplifying your ideas on social media. But equally for a politician, I remember the late Arun Jaitley saying to me, "My God, social media has changed my life. In the old days, if I wanted to get a message across," in those days he was still in the opposition, he said, "I would have to draft a press release, call a press conference, call 20 of my media friends to attend it, stand there, talk to them and get them to report it. Today, all I have to do is dictate a blog and put it out on the website, and I sit back and it's all in the newspapers the next day." And that really is equally true of tweets, of shorter messaging. So all I can say is these changes are real and more changes will come, but they don't happen overnight. Initially, you have traditional means of campaigning plus. Then the plus becomes heavier and more and more and more pluses, and perhaps the traditional means become less and less significant. But in my 3 Lok Sabha elections and 3 assembly elections that I've campaigned in, I have not seen anything disappearing from the campaign repertoire. I've only seen additions. So the jeeps are there, the rallies are there, the street corner stuff is there, the squad visits to people's homes are there, the leaflets and pamphlets are there. Every single traditional technique is still being used. Plus, there's also WhatsApp groups, YouTube videos, etc., etc. So what you're seeing now is additions and not subtractions. Will the additions push out the subtractions? Maybe in due course. But India is, in these respects, I'm sure, slower to change. But I haven't seen such rapid change in the West either.
It's interesting you mentioned, of course, WhatsApp groups, because, I see that as one of the weapons now used increasingly in elections. In Bengal, there are some 80,000 polling booths, and the BJP and I think the Trinamool has a WhatsApp group with administrators in charge for every booth.
That's right.
And sort of spreading the messages in real time. But is this a double-edged sword? As you said, you can sort of speak directly in a way to your voter in real time, send your messages. You don't need the media anymore all the time, certainly, to send out your messages. But is it a double-edged sword? Does it in some way also end up spreading misinformation, disinformation, dividing societies, and creating what I see is a hyper-polarized society as well? So is it a double-edged sword?
Absolutely. First of all, misinformation is absolutely there, partially because social media has no filters, unlike the good old days of the media when fact-checking was routine and everything went through an editor, a sub-editor, a copy editor, and so on before it saw the light of print. Today, everything goes directly on and is very quickly replicated because of the instantaneous nature of our social media. So even I, and I know you, have both been guilty of retweeting something which perhaps had not been verified, and these are things which lead us all to be accused of misinformation. Secondly, disinformation. The deliberate conveying of falsehoods gets a far, far freer play on social media, precisely because, again, there are no censors, no editors, no one checking. People can put things out there, and we are all obliged, I'm afraid, to take it at face value, especially if it comes from a relatively reputable source. And then there's also something worse, and that's hate speech incitement. We've had so many examples, and the most notorious recent one was President Trump being banned from Twitter and from other forms of social media for having incited the violence on Capitol Hill on the 6th of January. If that can happen to a sitting head of government and head of state, you can imagine how much more would have been deserved in cases where we have seen hate speech, particularly against the Muslim community in our country, coming out of so many politicians' social media accounts, and in many cases getting away with it for ages, for days on end before any action is taken. So all of those, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, are definitely a corollary risk. And I don't want to imply that social media is entirely blissful and straightforward, but But these negatives, I still would like to think, can be identified, can be reacted to, can be controlled, and more, even the social media gatekeepers are waking up to their responsibility not to let these things run around purely in the name of free speech, because though we all respect and value free speech, no one wants censorship. We do want to also worry about the health of our society and our politics.
You mentioned gatekeepers, and you mentioned the need perhaps for some filters at some level, because the fear is, and this is where the fear for the future of democracy comes, is on one hand, you've got the rise of populist strongmen or strong women across the world, and on the other hand, you have these large social media sites with very little sort of filters existing at the moment, the Facebooks and the Twitters of the world, and they almost seem to feed on each other. The rise of the sort of populist autocrat strongmen leaders across the world, and the rise of these large behemoths in the social media space. Do you think that they actually work in tandem? We've seen it with Trump, for example, where he was accused at times of using these misinformation and disinformation campaigns to his advantage. And we're seeing it with other leaders also being criticized for much the same reason. So
that's right.
Do you
So
believe
we're seeing all that, and at the same time, Rajdeep, we may be in danger of losing sight of the positives. Since our session is supposed to be about the future of this kind of digital democracy,
yes,
let me say that there are one set of very, very important positives we've overlooked. For example, the fact that social media has forced institutions of governance to be more accountable and responsive. That prior to the digital age, the balance of power rested firmly with the institutions of governance, your parliament, your executive, etc., was always much more powerful than the ordinary citizen. And as a result, the delivery of essential services, permissions, clearances were consistently plagued by delays, by red tapeism, by centralization of power, and ministers and senior officials were remote and inaccessible figures. But social media has changed that, right? It's forced institutions to evolve. The citizen now has a platform to highlight their concerns and amplify the reach of their concerns in a manner in which the government or the administration can no longer ignore their voices. For example, complaints regarding train services in India directly tag the railway social media handles. You might even get a reply from the railway minister. Citizens in distress abroad getting the attention of Sushma Swaraj when she was External Affairs Minister by directly writing to her on social media, and so on. It's also forced governments and institutions to concentrate on building public trust, since social media has forced everyone to implement new levels of transparency and accountability. And many institutions and government are now keen on fostering increasing goodwill by showcasing and highlighting their work on social media platforms. And this sort of two-way communication that for the first time is so easy between citizen and government. I mean, most of the time, I still remember, and you will remember, an era in which most people didn't know how to have access to their government representatives. Now you have, through social media, a direct form of being able to do that. So those are all the positives. But if one were to look at the negatives, and it's worth looking at that, one of the things I've noticed, particularly in the last couple of years of the COVID crisis, is the danger, when we talk about the future, of the rise of the surveillance state. Because during the COVID outbreak, a key issue that was often debated at the very beginning was the inadequacies of existing data systems to monitor and track the spread of the transmission of the virus, right? So people came up developing dedicated apps and tools to track people, their travel history, their contact with other infected individuals, and so on. The Arogya Setu app, you remember, was one example in India. Many countries had equivalents. But all of this stuff that tracks you is no longer necessarily linked only to a virus. You could easily see in a post-COVID world an enhanced deployment of surveillance and data gathering under the guise of preventing a similar scenario in the future. And how exactly this is implemented will be absolutely critical in determining an individual citizen's right to privacy. Because let's face it, an app that can tell you whether you have met an infected person can also tell the police if you have met an opposition leader, attended an opposition rally, gone someplace where the government wasn't happy to see you go, etc. On top of that, we know the surveillance state as a concept is not new. It's been written about widely for a couple of decades. But now with the rise of artificial intelligence and the open, almost unembarrassed collaboration between governments and big tech, coupled with the concentration of power, of artificial intelligence power and data in the hands of very few organizations and government, because they're very expensive, right? When this Pegasus software business came up, it was revealed at that time that Pegasus being the famous software where one missed call to your WhatsApp would give them access to your phone. Well, that software apparently costs 7 crores a pop. Now, how many individuals can afford it? Governments, of course, can. So suddenly you have this concentration of power, information, data, technology in the hands of the authorities and very few other very powerful, affluent organizations. So their ability to surveil you in real time has been enhanced. And in the realm of disease and pandemic management, that's great surveillance for public health, no one will quarrel with. But that can be used as the proximate excuse for constant upgrades and investment in government's abilities and large corporations' abilities to be in the surveillance mode. And that could have real worries for the safety and health of our democracy in future. I felt it necessary to lay that warning down because, who knows what the future really holds. And yet the danger of this, and certainly in a country like India, where our government has not been particularly good about its handling of data. We just heard recently how every single car registration data in this country collected by the state governments and shared with the center has been sold by the center to a private company for a fee of 1 crore a year. I mean, it's quite shocking. They're doing these things. Today's car registration data, tomorrow it could be your mobile phone tracing apps. So let's be very conscious that we are facing a real challenge for our democracy through the rise of the tools and techniques of digital surveillance.
At the end of the day, though, it comes to, achieving the right balance. For example, as you say, the digital world leads to perhaps greater accountability of public representatives, but it also means a loss of privacy. And that perhaps extends to the average citizen. With my Aadhaar card, I perhaps get better delivery of services than I did in the pre-digital era, but I'm also likely to have handed over many details of my life to the Indian state. So, I mean, I just wonder how you strike that balance. At one level, you do need accountability, you do need better delivery of services, and on the other, you cherish your privacy, but there is no space for privacy in this new world. So, I mean, do you see a possibility in the future of achieving that balance, or do you believe we just have to give up our privacy?
No, I don't think we have to. I don't think we have to give up our privacy, but I will say, Rajdeep, that we need to elect people with whom we can trust our privacy too. I mean, let me be very blunt and say, for example, that you can create institutions with enough independent checks and balances, or you can subvert them. It's very interesting, for example, that in the data protection bill that the government put forward, which is before a parliamentary select committee right now, that itself is another story. It should have come to my committee, but because I'm chairing it, it was taken away and given to a select committee chaired by a BJP member. That was very interesting. I had much earlier proposed in a private member's bill that we should have an independent data regulatory authority, which would consist of, former judge, somebody from a tech background, a tech company background, somebody from a consumer background, an interested stakeholder, yourself, whatever, that kind of independent body to be the final authority on deciding access to data, a release of data, return of data, and so on. Government retained the idea of a data regulatory authority, but decided to be staffed entirely by government-appointed bureaucrats. Now, you can see the difference. Obviously, the government-appointed bureaucrats will do the government's bidding, and the government's bidding will be to grab more of your data and find out more intrusive things about you, whereas the formula that I would have thought in a democracy would work better, and which other democracies, Europe, for example, the Western European democracies, are all following, is one in which they actually encourage an independent authority representative of society to be responsible for these kinds of issues on data. Now, there's just one example. I mean, you can build in checks and balances in a democracy, But if you have a government that doesn't want to, that actually wants more information, more control, and more surveillance, you're going to have a real problem. And so all I can say is our voters need to be enlightened enough to choose people and governments and authorities that respect their rights, privileges, freedoms, and privacy. Otherwise, they will get the government they vote for, and the government they vote for may not let them enjoy those rights for too long.
Are you saying that governments of the day are now, both at the state and local and national level, more accountable to the voter, to the people, than they were when you started off in public life 10 years ago, because of the proliferation of this digital ecosystem? Are you saying that that gap between the voter and the leader, which was seen to be huge, has actually shrunk because there's this sense of directly connecting to my public representative?
Yes, I already said that, Rajdeep. I won't repeat myself, but there's no doubt.
So I'm just wondering whether you believe that in the next 10 years that gap will actually shrink further?
That's it. So social media has democratized the space for thought. It has allowed the outsider to find a space in our politics, in our governmental life, develop their own narrative, communicate directly to authorities, all of that. But equally, it has empowered the government by giving the government more and more tools to influence you, to inform you, to misinform you, to surveil you, etc. Now, balance is possible, but it will unfortunately depend on the goodwill of the government, whether it wants to give you that space. So if we are going to ensure through social media, through our digital democracy, that we want to ensure that our government recognizes certain curbs on its rights to invade our privacy, take and dispose of our data, etc. If we want that, then to be honest, Rajdeep, we have to vote for it, because given a free hand, governments like to arrogate more power, more control to themselves, and we've certainly seen that at work with the present government.
And you therefore see also with that the rise of what, as I referred briefly to, the rise of the sort of strongmen leaders, the rise of the personality cult, with this sort of multimedia universe in which we live, where the medium is the message, and someone who's an effective communicator can actually just capture the entire political narrative and leave very little space for anyone else to have a counterpoint, particularly if that individual is backed by huge resources.
No, the counterpoint exists, but unfortunately everyone's in silos. They're preaching to the converted. So there is no doubt, for example, that those who are recipients of the ruling party and the government's messaging are inundated, as you rightly observed, by a single-minded narrative that is supportive and admiring of the government, and the Prime Minister builds up the personality cult of the Prime Minister, all of that. Whereas there are other kinds of messaging, satirical messaging about the government, cartoons, memes, things poking fun of the government that are also going around, but they tend by and large to move within their own circles. So I probably get a lot more anti-government messaging than any of my BJP MP friends are seeing on their WhatsApps. Perhaps you, if you are exposed sufficiently to both sides, are getting both. But many, many Indian citizens are not. They are getting a sort of shall we say,
so we're living in our
chamber.
That's right. I was going to use the word. It seems as if that we're all living in our echo chambers and talking at each other rather than talking to each other. So I just wonder whether the space for dialogue, the space for engaging with each other is actually getting more and more restricted. And that worries me, because in the future then we become a much more hyper-polarized society.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. And it's ironic in some ways, because social media, which, as I said earlier, has forced institutions of governance to be more accountable and responsive, and which has given the citizen more access to government, has also divided us and has also put us into these different echo chambers, has also managed to make us more vulnerable to the farther and deeper reach and control of those in power. So how do we manage to strike? It's interesting, for example, when you remember as recently as 2013, 12, 13, 14, the Anna Hazare protests, they were not as big on social media as they were on television. They were blanketing the television space, and that's how the opposition narrative dominated. When it came to the anti-CAA protests just before COVID, I mean, that is 2019, you found a lot of the protests were very active and intense where they were and were being covered and reported within echo chambers, but could also be ruthlessly excised from the public media in terms of limited coverage on television and being blanked out of the social media of the ruling party and the authorities. So it becomes a very different phenomenon. I'm still coming to terms with how this is going to work with the next set of protests. The farmers' protests were the next.
I was just going to come to that.
And that's turned out to be quite interesting because the farmers organized themselves to actually put out social media messaging. And you may remember that when things reached their peak, the government and the police decided to shut the internet down in those areas where the farmers around Shingur had concentrated and were sending out videos and messages. Even the live Facebook feed of the tractor rally being taken out with court permission by the farmers was unable to be broadcast because their internet feed was cut. Now, this is worrying. We've seen this in Kashmir, where the government essentially shut down the internet. They will argue it was not against protests, it was against terrorism. Fair enough. But the truth is that even the court said there is a disproportionate impact of shutting down 4G services and therefore de facto internet for an entire population versus trying to deny access to it for a handful of terrorists, and there have got to be better ways of being able to do it. But when you look at something like Shingur, it was a very deliberate action by the government and the police authorities to curb the ability of the farmers to get their messages across to the general public. And that worries me because if social media can be curbed in that manner, then social media as a vehicle for dissent, as we've seen, for example, with the Black Lives Matter protests, or even earlier the Jasmine Revolution in North Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, where social media played a major role, or even in Hong Kong till the Chinese came and cranked down on it. What happens to all of that in future? Do we actually incentivize governments to be more heavy-handed in curbing our social media in order to control these protests, as China has done in Hong Kong, as the government of India and the Delhi police did with the farmers? So the question is, which direction will democracies take? And I have to come back to the political choice we make. Will we elect people who will safeguard the rights of protesters, dissenters, and so on, or will we elect people who crack them down with a heavy hand? And there, I must say, public sympathies, by and large, seem to be much more with
cracking down.
Cracking down. If you look at some of the recent polls, there was a study by the Azim Premji University that found that 50%, I believe it was, in fact, I'm writing about this in a column next month, 50% of respondents in 4 large Indian states expressed a preference for an authoritarian alternative to our existing democracy. And there was a Harvard study by Monk and Foer, which found that India was actually amongst the worst countries in terms of expressing support for non-democratic or authoritarian models of governance. For example, they had a sentence saying, a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections is a good way to run this country. And they asked people to agree. Over 70% of Indians said yes, behind only Russia and Romania in the whole world. Even Pakistan didn't say. Pakistan, 62% said yes. In India, it was over 70. And this desire for a strong leader in India has given us the disasters we're facing today from having elected and re-elected a strong leader, quote unquote. So all I can say is that for us, democracy in the future of our country requires checks and balances, an effort to promote consensus, autonomous institutions that can have some sort of a balancing impact upon government's overweening power, as well as, of course, the rights of citizens to express themselves, to disagree, to dissent, to have free speech on media and social media, and, of course, to have their own rights of privacy. And all of this as a package will have to constitute our understanding of democracy in the future. Will we be allowed to do that? Your guess is as good as mine.
Well, I can even add the Pew's the Pew's research also showed this sort of preference for a more sort of dictatorial approach to decision making. But you mentioned the farmers' protest, and in some ways, again, it becomes a double-edged sword. Some thought that the social media images were just magnifying what was happening. The others thought that it was giving voice to people who are otherwise voiceless, and gave the farmers an opportunity in a way to challenge the state and put their view. It also melted global boundaries. I think, the fact is that people in Canada, in United Kingdom, in America were also sort of responding to the farmer protests in a manner that perhaps was unlikely 10, 20 years ago, some charged with sedition as a result. So I just, as we sort of look at the big picture, are you hopeful? Is the glass half full, or is the glass half empty? Or you believe that the next 10 years, the next decade will be this disruptive decade wherein we will either face a greater state, we will see the greater state control over all forms of dissent through social media, or we will see public outcry forcing a greater opening up and a form of citizen journalism or citizen activism coming to the fore. I guess the jury is out.
Yeah, the jury is out, and as I express my own pessimism about the rise of the surveillance state, let me equally say that the answer to your question will become apparent in the next few months. The colossal mismanagement of the COVID crisis and the crisis faced by ordinary citizens throughout the country today, as the virus runs through our land like wildfire, completely demonstrating the failure of our authorities to plan, to equip, to expand hospital capacity, to create enough resources for manufacturing vaccines, for putting enough ventilators, ICUs, etc. in place, as more and more people die, as crematoria and mortuaries are overflowing. But all of these things happen. There is bound to be, in the normal course, a public outcry. Will the government be able to use these tools we've talked about to clamp down on it? Or will they actually find themselves forced to surrender, as it were, to acknowledge their own failures and mistakes? We will see. This is not a government that has ever showed any inclination to admit its own errors, even though it's made several. And it's also a government which in many ways has learned how to manipulate social media and the whole digital tools of governance to its advantage. So in these circumstances, we'll have to see. And then, it may well be inspired by a country like China. In Hong Kong, let's not forget that in that worst political crisis that the Chinese had ever experienced, when the Hong Kong protesters really ran rampant and they were leaderless and decentralized, it was a faceless movement in many ways, even though there were some elected Hong Kong leaders. By and large, ideas were gaining traction, smaller groups were spun off to coordinate specific actions, posters or memes were shared in Telegram chat groups, were printing them out and posting them around the city. The dissenters were financed by crowdfunding raised on social media. The iPhone is very popular in Hong Kong, so Apple's AirDrop function allowed them to bypass the government's official telephone lines and spread information rapidly. All of these things happened, and suddenly the Chinese realized that this place had got out of control, that it was literally one country, two systems, and that Hong Kong was a hyper-democracy being ostensibly accountable to a one-party authoritarian communist state. And Beijing said enough is enough, and they cracked down, they arrested people, they amended the rules under which Hong Kong is governed, they shut down the freedoms on social media, and they disqualified large numbers of democratic representatives, wouldn't allow them to proceed. Now, China can do that. I hope India can't, because India still is a democracy, and I would like to believe that our government still values the cachet it gets internationally and globally from being a democracy. So how far will our government go, and how will our democracy evolve? I would say the next 2.5, 3 years leading to the elections of 2024 will be determining. I don't think we'll need to wait 10 years. By 2024, it will be very clear in what direction India is going and what the people of India are prepared to either tolerate or accept or vote for. And that will give us a clear indication as to where to go. I think the big sort of battle for India's soul that I've been talking about and warning about for 2 elections already may really be reaching its climax in the next one.
Interesting. We just have a couple of minutes to go, and I know you're coughing away, and you've been sort of very kind enough to to join us, even though you clearly are unwell. Before I open up to those couple of questions, just wanted to know a thought that I had, and I think you've expressed this once publicly. Here we are doing the AIMA convention via Zoom, connecting people, delegates are there. I wonder why Parliament doesn't do it. You know, in the last 1 year, Parliament has barely met, and most of the sessions, including the most recent one, were truncated. One of the fears was COVID. I'm just wondering, in the times that we live in, if COVID is such a warlike emergency that the country faces, why can't the 543 members of the Lok Sabha and the 230 odd members of the Rajya Sabha, in a way, be connected through a digital footprint?
Exactly, and the 30 members of each parliamentary committee, which are also not allowed to meet virtually. The government is basically, and the parliament leaders, that is the chairman of the Rajya Sabha and the speaker of the Lok Sabha, have taken the stand that it has to be physical meetings. And I don't understand why. I have been writing to the speaker since last year, both about Parliament itself and about committee meetings. I chair a committee, and I find it very difficult to assemble a quorum. I've just cancelled a meeting that was scheduled for this week 2 days ago, precisely because I don't have a quorum. And you know, even when I initially had enough acceptances, as the COVID situation got worse, people started cancelling on me, and I didn't have a quorum. Now, I've said to the speaker, either we reduce the quorum requirement or eliminate it for those meetings that aren't taking decisions or adopting reports, so we can meet and hold government accountable. Or we find a better solution, because in this modern day and age, for us to insist on everything being done physically or not at all actually plays into the hands of those who don't want parliamentary accountability. And I think that's most unfortunate.
You know, Himanshu Agarwal has a question for you, Dr. Tharoor, which is, you know, he believes that social media needs to be used by politicians through differentiated messaging to interact directly with citizens. Now, as you said, a few politicians have done it successfully. I thought the late Sushma Swaraj used it very successfully to sort of reach out to NRIs and other citizens who felt they were, needed government support. Others have done it. You're an example of it, and some other MPs, including Prime Minister Modi, have used the medium well. Many, of course, say that as a result, you're bypassing. I mean, my criticism, this is not linked necessarily to Himanshu's question, is that you bypass traditional media and thereby prevent us from holding you accountable. Leaders of today hold less and less press conferences, both at the center and in state governments. And so there are, while you, how do you engage with citizens more constructively, and how do you ensure that the traditional media is not bypassed?
Well, frankly, you do need to bypass traditional media for many of the situations we find ourselves in, because it usually involves citizens in distress who need to reach to people in authority directly. By the time the media pays attention to them and amplifies it, precious time is lost. So whether it's somebody, as I mentioned earlier, tagging the railway minister's social media handles about a crisis on an ongoing journey from his train compartment, whether it's a citizen abroad whose passport is gone and who has a flight to catch, tagging the external affairs minister, whether it's people reaching out for my help in my constituency, or even for that matter, politicians in other states, when the COVID lockdown happened, politicians in other states didn't know what to do about their constituents stranded in Kerala, and the one politician they knew in Kerala was me. So I got tagged by politicians from Bengal and Nagaland and Rajasthan and Himachal saying, we have so-and-so citizens stuck in such and such place, can you help? And it was a delight to be able to do that. But honestly, bypassing you guys was the only way to, because the need was immediate and you didn't have a relevant role that much to play.
No, bypassing conversely, us was more from us holding you accountable. I mean,
conversely, so all these immediate humanitarian kinds of situations we're dealing with every single day. And I get requests every single day, including very recently in Kerala, I had this incredible protest campaign by students against having to go and take a physical examination as COVID was running rampant. And I realized how serious it was by seeing the sheer volume and intensity of the concerns. I called the governor myself, and he had not noticed how bad the problem was. In fact, he wasn't aware that there was this thing happening. And I must say, he responded immediately and postponed the examinations within a matter of hours. So by the time these people would have written to all of you in the media and you would have done an article or a TV news story, and whether it would have reached the governor's attention, this is a far more efficient way of achieving the result that these citizens wanted. But let me give you a different example of bypassing media constructively. Even though it was not appreciated at the time by you guys, when I was Minister of State for External Affairs in my first year of office, and I was the only politician controversially using Twitter, when I went to Liberia, it was the first visit by any Indian minister in 38 years. Similarly, when I went to Haiti in the aftermath of the earthquake there, it was the first Indian ministerial visit ever. But both were completely ignored in India by the mainstream media, by TV, by newspapers, everything. The only way the Indian public knew about any of this was through my Twitter updates and the links I posted at that time. And if it's a legitimate interest for an Indian minister to promote India's Africa diplomacy or our Haiti relief efforts, then it was only through social media I could do so, because for you guys, it's not a very interesting story. That's part of the problem.
Shashi, Dr. Tharoor, we've virtually come to the end of this session. I just want to say this. I was in Kerala, as I said a few weeks ago, covering the campaign in Thiruvananthapuram. I went to University College in Thiruvananthapuram, where all the students were mainly left supporters. But they said, we'll vote for Dr. Tharoor as our MP, but for our MLA, we are going to choose the left. Now, I don't know whether that is good news or bad news for you during a state election. But either way, I think you've been a politician ahead of your times, particularly in the way you've engaged with citizens using social media. And maybe if we had many more like you who used it constructively, I think we'd build a better democracy. As I said, and I think we've said, it's a double-edged sword, but it is something that holds enormous, there is an enormous capacity in social media to help build a better democracy. So thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor, for sharing your thoughts. Stay well. I hope that you recover from that cough and cold soon enough. And thanks very much for joining us, and to AIMA again for having us on this session. Two campaignites talking to each other. It's been great fun. Thank you. Thank you, Sanjeev, and thank you all.
Thank you, Rajdeep.